Hi everyone. Tonight, we're squeezing sideways through a doorway that was never designed for actual human shoulders, climbing a staircase built at the approximate angle of a ladder, and trusting our lives to a rope, a hook, and a beam sticking out of a gable 3 stories above the street. Welcome to a 17th century canal house in Amsterdam, where the ceilings are low, the taxes are higher than the buildings, and everybody in town has apparently agreed that stairs are for people with something to prove. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying yourself here. Leave a comment telling me where you're tucking in from and what time it is for you, because it always seems to be somewhere around 2 a.m, no matter the time zone. Now dim the lights, get horizontal, and maybe keep both arms inside the blanket, because somewhere below your window, a canal is quietly doing several jobs it was never built for. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered why a house would be built narrower than most modern hallways? Could you survive climbing 4 flights of stairs, so steep they're basically a polite suggestion? Would you trust a rope and pulley system to lower your grandmother's writing desk through a 3rd-floor window? And could you get through a single Tuesday in a city where the water outside your door is simultaneously your street, your sewer, and your delivery service? Well, congratulations. You've just arrived in Amsterdam in the year 1660, the golden age of trade, tulips, and extremely judgmental neighbours. Mind the gable hook on your way in. Your journey into the city doesn't end at a train platform or a gate. It ends on the water, easing alongside a canal so choked with barges, rowboats, and cargo skiffs that the surface barely qualifies as liquid anymore. Someone tosses your trunk onto the cobblestones before you've fully found your balance, and a boatman mutters something about the tide that you're fairly sure was an insult. The air here smells like tar, wet rope, and something faintly fishy that you'll later learn is simply Tuesday. Gulls shriek overhead, competing with the creak of timber hulls rubbing against each other like the world's largest, slowest game of bumper cars. Men in dark wool coats shout prices at each other across the water, hauling crates of pepper, bolts of cloth, and barrels that slosh in a way that suggests they are not carrying water. You step onto the quay and immediately understand something crucial about this city. The street and the canal are not 2 separate things here. They are business partners, and neither one particularly respects your personal space. Amsterdam in this era is one of the busiest ports on the planet. Its canal ring barely a few decades old, and already ringed with warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with goods from 4 continents. Ships queue for berths the way you might queue for a parking spot at a busy mall, except the stakes are higher, and the cargo occasionally includes live monkeys, destined for some merchant's private curiosity cabinet. Every barge that glides past you is loaded so precariously that it seems to defy basic physics, riding just inches above the waterline, manned by someone who looks utterly unbothered by the fact that one wrong wave could redecorate the canal with cinnamon. You'll notice quickly that nobody walks in a straight line here. The quays are narrow, cluttered with crates, coiled rope, and the occasional dozing dog, so pedestrians weave and duck and sidestep with the practiced ease of people who have never once considered that a sidewalk could simply be flat and empty.
porters trot past with impossible loads balanced on their shoulders, moving with a rhythm that says they've done this 10,000 times and will happily do it 10,000 more, provided you get out of the way.
Ever tried to navigate an airport baggage claim, while everyone around you is also somehow doing their actual job at the same time? That's the key, minus the flat floors and plus the occasional live goat. And somewhere in the middle of all this organised chaos, someone is already eyeing your trunk, your coat, and your general air of not knowing where you're going, and deciding exactly how much to charge you to carry it 3 streets over. So you gather your things, step carefully around a coil of tar-soaked rope, and take your first proper breath of Amsterdam air. Salt and smoke and ambition, all tangled together. It's loud, it's damp, and it smells faintly of prosperity and low tide in equal measure. Welcome to the busiest few square miles of water in the world. Try not to fall in on your first day. Everyone does, eventually, but there's no need to rush it. Let's talk about your new home, or rather, the sliver of brick standing between 2 other slivers of brick that Amsterdam insists on calling a house. It is remarkably tall, remarkably deep, and remarkably narrow, roughly the width of a generous hallway. This isn't a design choice born of taste. It's a design choice born of a property tax based entirely on how much canal frontage your house occupies, which means every homeowner in the city has spent generations quietly competing to look as thin as possible from the outside. Stand across the canal and look at the whole row, and you'll see exactly what this tax has produced. A long, tidy wall of houses no wider than a modest living room, each one stretching backward into the block like a magic trick, somehow containing 4 or 5 full stories of rooms, storage, and family life, inside what looks from the front like a bookshelf. The width of your front door alone will tell any passerby roughly how much money your household has, since a slightly wider plot meant a genuinely staggering tax bill. And nobody in this city pays a staggering tax bill without a very good reason. Inside, the house unfolds in ways that feel almost architecturally rude. Rooms are stacked directly on top of one another, connected by that staircase you'll meet properly in a moment, with ceilings low enough that anyone over average height develops an instinctive stoop by the end of their first week. The front rooms, the ones facing the canal, are for show, polished and formal, meant to be seen through the generous windows by anyone strolling past. The back rooms are for actual living, tucked away from public view, because appearances here are managed with the same precision as the household accounts. The brick facade itself leans, quite literally, forward over the street by a few careful degrees, a detail that looks like subsidence, but is in fact deliberate. It gives just enough clearance for exactly the kind of furniture hoisting operation you're about to witness, without anything scraping the wall on the way up. It's engineering disguised as a design flourish, the 17th century equivalent of building a garage door slightly crooked so the moving truck can fit. Ever lived in a city apartment so narrow you could touch both walls at once with your arms out? Multiply that by 5 floors and add a family, 2 servants, a warehouse's worth of trade goods in the basement, and you have a fairly accurate picture of what you're about to call home. The gable at the top, shaped like a bell, a neck, or a simple triangle depending on your neighbour's taste and budget, isn't just decoration either. It's the final flourish on a building that has been quietly, relentlessly optimised for one single purpose: taking up as little canal frontage as legally possible, while still, somehow, being enormous. So you stand at the threshold of your new home, a house that is essentially a very tall, very narrow monument to creative tax avoidance, and prepare to go inside. The door is standing open. The stairs, unfortunately, are not going to be gentle about what comes next. Let's discuss the stairs, because you're about to meet them, and they are not going to be gentle about it. Steep, narrow, and set at an angle that seems to have skipped several safety negotiations, these stairs were built for people who have already committed fully to going up or down, with no room for hesitation, second thoughts, or dignity. You will learn quickly to climb facing forward and descend facing the wall, like everyone else in this city who has ever carried a chamber pot after dark. The steps themselves are shallow, barely wide enough for the ball of your foot, and set at a pitch that a modern building inspector would take one look at and quietly leave the country. There's a rope or a simple rail bolted to the wall, which you will grip with both hands the way a sailor grips rigging in a storm, because that is essentially what this is. The wood creaks under every step, worn smooth and slightly concave in the middle from centuries of stockinged feet, and the whole staircase spirals upward through the house in a tight, sensible column that eats almost no floor space at all, which was rather the point. Nobody in this household finds any of this remarkable. The maid flies up and down, carrying a full chamber pot in one hand and a candle in the other, without so much as a wobble. Children treat it like a plaything, sliding partway down the handrail when nobody official is watching. Only you, fresh off the boat and still trusting your knees to behave like knees, will approach each flight like it's a hostage negotiation. Descending backward, as though climbing down a ladder, isn't some quaint old custom for show. It's simply survival. The pitch is often close to 50 degrees, steep enough that going down forward means trusting your centre of gravity to a set of stairs roughly the width of a bread loaf. Generations of Amsterdammers have quietly agreed that the backward climb is the only dignified option, and after your first near miss, you'll agree too. Ever tried descending one of those impossibly steep ladders bolted to the side of a ship, the kind where you instinctively grab both rails and lower yourself like you're escaping a submarine? That's every trip to bed in this house. That's every trip to fetch more bread. That's simply Tuesday, again, indefinitely. The reason for all this discomfort traces straight back to that tax on canal frontage. A wider, gentler staircase would have eaten into the one resource this house cannot spare, which is width. So the household sacrificed comfort, sacrificed convenience, sacrificed no small number of bruised shins over the centuries, all so the house could stay thin enough to keep the taxman satisfied. It's a trade every single resident of this street has made without complaint, mostly because complaining wouldn't make the stairs any wider. So you take a breath, grip the rope, and start your ascent one careful, forward-facing step at a time, silently promising your knees a long apology. At the top, or perhaps halfway there, waits the real challenge of moving into a house like this, because your furniture is never, ever making this climb. It's time to get your belongings inside, and this is where things get genuinely alarming. That hook jutting from the gable above your front door isn't decorative. It's the only way anything larger than a dinner plate is getting into this house, because the staircase you just met would never allow it. Furniture, barrels, and the occasional piano get hoisted up the outside of the building and posted through an open window like an extremely expensive letter. Stand in the street for a moment and watch it happen, because it's worth seeing at least once with your own eyes. A rope runs from the hook at the top of the gable down to a heavy wooden chest waiting on the cobblestones. Two men haul on the rope, while a third leans out of a third-floor window, guiding the swaying load past the brickwork with nothing but his hands, his nerve, and a colourful string of instructions that the whole street can hear. The chest spins slowly as it rises, clearing the sill by what looks like the width of a coin, and disappears through the window into the room beyond. Nobody applauds. This is simply how it's done, several times a week on every street in the city. The system exists because the house tilts forward at just the right angle to give the rope a clean drop past the facade, missing the windows on every floor below the target. It's not luck, it's architecture, built specifically to accommodate this exact maneuver. The same forward lean that made the house look faintly like it was bowing to you when you first arrived. Practical and theatrical in equal measure, which describes rather a lot of things in this city. Larger households hire this out to men who do nothing else for a living, professional furniture hoisters who can read the sway of a rope the way a sailor reads wind. Smaller households do it themselves, with predictably more shouting and considerably more property damage. Either way, the whole neighbourhood ends up as an audience, leaning out of their own windows to watch, offer commentary, and occasionally place small wagers on whether the wardrobe makes it. Ever tried to get a couch up a narrow apartment stairwell? The kind where you end up tipping it at an angle that makes your neighbours nervous and your back permanently unhappy. Now imagine skipping the stairwell entirely and just launching the couch out a window on a rope, 3 stories up, in front of the entire street. That's moving day here, and somehow the success rate is better than yours. Not everything makes the journey unscathed, of course. Barrels crack, ropes fray at the worst possible moment. There's a reason every household keeps a story about the time a cousin's clock ended up in the canal instead of the parlour. And there's a reason that story gets told, with relish, at every family gathering afterward. The Canal, ever patient, accepts these small tributes without comment. So your trunk goes up the traditional way, swinging gently past 3 floors of open windows and startled pigeons, before vanishing into the house above you. You follow it inside a moment later, considerably less gracefully, using the stairs and your own 2 feet like the amateur you clearly still are. Somewhere above, your belongings have already arrived and are waiting, smug and unscratched, for you to catch up. Let's talk about who actually lives here, because a canal house is rarely just one family rattling around in private. There's the merchant who owns the place, his wife, who almost certainly runs more of the business than she gets credit for, several children, a maid or 2, and possibly a boarder tucked into the attic, paying rent for the privilege of hitting his head on the ceiling beams every morning. The house, despite looking impossibly slim from the street, somehow absorbs all of these people with the quiet efficiency of a very well-organized suitcase. The merchant occupies the grandest room on the main floor, the one with the tall windows facing the canal, where he can be seen conducting business by anyone strolling past, which is precisely the point. His wife moves fluidly between the kitchen, the ledgers, and the front room, managing a household that functions more like a small, well-run company than a modern family home. The children are underfoot everywhere, tumbling down that treacherous staircase with a fearlessness that makes your own cautious descent look faintly embarrassing. The maid rises before everyone else, hauling water, lighting fires, and scrubbing the front stoop before the street has properly woken up, and she goes to bed considerably after everyone else has stopped needing anything from her. Her room, if she has a private one at all, is a narrow space tucked under the eaves where the roofline slopes so sharply that she can only stand fully upright in one specific spot, which she has memorized the way you might memorize the location of a light switch in the dark. Then there's the border, a common feature of these houses, since renting out the attic or an upper floor to a bachelor clerk or a visiting merchant helps offset the rent on a home this size. He keeps mostly to himself, eats separately, and has developed a permanent defensive crouch from years of misjudging exactly where the ceiling beams are. You'll adopt the same crouch within the week. Everyone does. Meals happen at set hours around a table that somehow seats everyone, despite the room around it barely qualifying as spacious. Conversation ranges from the price of pepper to the latest gossip from the church, and everyone, including the children, is expected to have an opinion on both. Privacy, as a concept, barely exists. You will hear your neighbours argue through the shared wall. Your household will hear you do the same. Ever lived in a share house where everyone somehow knows everyone else's business without anyone ever technically gossiping? That's every floor of this building, stacked 5 high for the rest of your stay. Nobody has secrets here. The walls are thin, the stairs are loud, and the maid, frankly, knows everything anyway. So you settle into your small corner of this crowded, narrow, surprisingly warm little household, already feeling less like a lodger and more like an extra pair of hands the family didn't quite ask for, but will happily put to use. There's a broom leaning against the wall with your name on it, metaphorically speaking. Best to get used to that too. It's time to introduce you properly to the water, because you'll be living beside it, smelling it, and occasionally regretting it for the rest of your stay. The canal is a road, a drainage system, a delivery route, and on a bad day, considerably worse than all three combined. Locals have developed a very particular skill: the ability to admire how picturesque the canal looks, while carefully not thinking too hard about what's actually in it. Lean out your window in the early morning, and you'll see the canal at its most deceptively lovely. Pale light catching the ripples, a heron standing with great dignity on a mooring post, a barge gliding past loaded with cheese wheels stacked like cannonballs. It's the version of the canal that ends up in paintings, calm and golden and faintly romantic. Give it a few hours, though, and the picture changes considerably. By midday, the canal is doing several jobs at once, none of them particularly compatible with each other. It's the route the milkman rows to deliver to the kitchen door. It's the place household waste quietly, unofficially finds its way into, despite regulations that exist specifically to prevent this. It's where the tannery upstream sends its runoff drifting past your window with a smell that makes you reconsider your life choices. And it's still, somehow, the water several households nearby are drawing for washing, because the alternative is hauling it from further away, and nobody has that kind of energy before breakfast. The city has rules about all of this, genuinely strict ones about dumping refuse and managing waste, enforced by officials who patrol and fine offenders with real regularity. But rules in a densely packed city with thousands of households sharing one network of standing water have an uneasy relationship at the best of times, and the canal, ever patient, absorbs the overflow of both compliance and its absence in equal measure. Ever lived somewhere with a beautiful view that you've quietly learned to enjoy with your eyes only, never your nose? That's the canal, every single day, for everyone who lives beside one. The wealthy merchant with the grandest house on the block breathes the same air as the tanner's apprentice 3 doors down, and neither of them mentions it at dinner, because mentioning it wouldn't change anything, and Amsterdam has never been a city that wastes words on problems it can't immediately solve. Come winter, if the season is cold enough, the whole unruly, aromatic mess freezes solid and transforms into something genuinely magical. But we'll get to that particular reversal of fortune later. For now, you simply learn to live beside it, to appreciate the ripple of morning light without inspecting it too closely, and to keep your windows shut on warmer afternoons. It's the great unspoken bargain of canal life: astonishing beauty, questionable ventilation, and no refunds. Let's talk about where you'll actually be sleeping, which is a wooden cupboard built directly into the wall, curtains and all. The Dutch box bed is part furniture, part fortress against the cold, and part deeply confusing to anyone who has never had to climb into a cabinet to go to sleep. You'll be sitting nearly upright, wedged in like a very expensive stored blanket, and you'll understand within one night exactly why. The bed itself is short, shorter than seems reasonable for a full-grown adult, which has led generations of visitors to assume the Dutch were simply smaller people. They were not, particularly. The real reason is a stubborn, deeply held belief that sleeping fully flat invites all sorts of trouble: congestion, apoplexy, evil spirits. Take your pick of the era's medical theories. So people slept propped up on a small mountain of pillows and bolsters instead. You climb in, arrange yourself at something close to an upright sitting position, and pull the wooden doors or curtains most of the way shut, sealing yourself into a snug little box within the larger box of the house. There's real logic buried in the discomfort. A closed bed traps body heat far better than an open one, which matters enormously in a house with drafty windows, thin walls, and a single fireplace expected to warm several floors at once. The curtains or doors also grant something rare and precious in a house this crowded: an actual moment of privacy, a small wooden room within the room where you can pretend, briefly, that you are not sharing every meal, every argument, and every creak of the staircase with 6 other people. Servants and children often sleep in a simpler version, tucked into a wall niche or a fold-down bench that becomes a bed at night and a bench again by morning. An early and genuinely clever bit of space-saving furniture design in a house that has none to spare. The wealthier the household, the more elaborately carved and curtained the box bed becomes, sometimes serving as a small status display in the main room, proudly showing off good linens and fine woodwork to any visitor who happens to glance over. Ever tried sleeping upright on a long flight, propped against a pillow, convinced you'll wake up feeling refreshed, and instead waking up feeling like a folded lawn chair? That's every single night in a box bed, except you've committed to it for the length of your entire stay, and there's no seatbelt sign to blame it on. You'll fold yourself in, pull the little doors closed, and lie there in the dark, snug, slightly claustrophobic, and oddly cosy all at once, listening to the house settle and the canal murmur outside the window. It takes some getting used to. By the end of the week, you may find yourself unreasonably fond of your wooden cupboard, the way you might grow fond of anything that keeps you warm and asks very little in return. Let's discuss breakfast, which involves rye bread, a slab of cheese, and quite possibly a mug of small beer before you've been awake for 10 minutes. Nobody's day is starting with a cocktail here. It's starting with weak beer, because the water is not to be trusted, and everyone from the household maid to the toddler in the corner has made peace with that fact centuries ago. The bread itself is dense, dark, and faintly sour, sliced thin and spread with butter, if the household can afford it, and eaten with a kind of brisk efficiency that suggests nobody here considers breakfast a leisurely affair. Cheese arrives in generous, unapologetic slabs, a proper Gouda or Edam wheel sitting on the table like a small yellow moon, cut fresh each morning and eaten without ceremony. If you're lucky, there's herring too, pale and briny, eaten whole with a practised tilt of the head that you have not yet mastered, and will almost certainly embarrass yourself attempting. The small beer is the real surprise for newcomers. A thin, low-alcohol brew, brewed specifically to be safer than the local water, which carries all manner of unwelcome passengers thanks to the Canal's multitasking arrangement you learned about a moment ago. Children drink a version of it too, weaker still, and nobody bats an eye, because in a city built on standing water, beer isn't a vice. It's basic hygiene with a pleasant aftertaste. The household gathers around the table for this brief, business-like meal, with none of the lingering you might expect. The merchant is already thinking about the ships due in that morning. His wife is mentally running through the day's errands, the marketing, the accounts, the letter that needs answering. The children eat quickly, because lingering earns a sharp word, and the maid eats standing, if she eats at all, before the rest of the house has been served. Breakfast here is fuel, not entertainment, consumed with the same efficiency as everything else in a household that treats time like money. Because in this city, increasingly, it is. Ever grabbed a piece of toast and a coffee standing at the kitchen counter because you were already running late for a meeting that started 5 minutes ago? That's breakfast here. Except swap the coffee for weak beer and the toast for bread dense enough to double as a doorstop, and you've got the picture precisely. By the time the meal wraps up, the maid is already clearing plates, the merchant is reaching for his coat, and the day, brisk and purposeful, has officially begun. You'll finish your own slice of bread and cheese a little more slowly than everyone else, still adjusting to a household that treats mornings less like a gentle transition into the day and more like a starting gun. It's time to talk about cleaning, because this city has taken it to a level that borders on a competitive sport. Stoops are scrubbed daily. Windows are polished until they practically disappear. Even the pavement in front of the house gets a wash, which seems excessive until you remember there's an entire canal of questionable water sitting 15 feet away, quietly daring the household to slip up. Watch the street in the early morning, and you'll see it happening, up and down the entire block in near unison. Maids and housewives on their knees with buckets and brushes, working the front step until it gleams, then moving on to the brickwork, the door handle, occasionally the cobblestones directly outside the house, as though the public street itself were an extension of the family's reputation. In a way, it is. A dirty stoop here isn't simply untidy. It's a small, visible confession that the household inside can't be bothered to keep up appearances. And appearances, as you're already learning, matter enormously in this city. The windows receive their own devoted attention, polished with a vinegar solution and buffed with old cloths until the glass all but disappears, offering any passer-by an uninterrupted view straight into the front room. This isn't an accident. Large, spotless windows are practically an invitation, a way of proudly displaying the family's good furniture, fine paintings, and general prosperity to the entire street. A smudged window here reads roughly the way a stained shirt might read at a job interview. Inside, the cleaning continues with a rigour that would make a modern hotel inspector weep with joy. Floors are swept and occasionally sanded to a particular pattern for special occasions. Brass fittings are polished until they blind you. Bedding is aired, beaten, and turned with a regularity that suggests dust itself has been declared a personal enemy of the household. The maid, already exhausted from the morning's water hauling and firelighting, moves through all of this with the brisk, joyless efficiency of someone who knows precisely how many more tasks remain before she can finally sit down. Some of this obsessive tidiness traces back to genuine practical necessity. Since a damp climate and a city built on soggy, reclaimed land breeds mold and rot at an alarming rate if left unchecked. But a good deal more of it comes from something less practical and more cultural. A widely shared belief that cleanliness reflects moral character, that a well-scrubbed home indicates a well-ordered soul, and that letting standards slip even slightly invites the judgment of every neighbour peering through their own spotless window. Ever cleaned your entire apartment before guests arrived, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean purely because the idea of anyone judging your home terrifies you more than the actual work does? That's this entire street, every single morning, forever, with the added pressure of a canal right outside actively working against them. So the scrubbing continues, stoop by stoop, window by window, down the length of the block, until the whole street gleams under a fresh coat of collective, slightly anxious cleanliness. By mid-morning, the job is done, the buckets are emptied, and everyone moves on to the next task, already dreading tomorrow's repeat performance. Let's head out to the market, a chaotic, fragrant sprawl of stalls selling herring, cheese wheels the size of cartwheels, and spices that arrived on a ship from somewhere most of your neighbours couldn't point to on a map. Haggling is expected, elbowing is tolerated, and somehow everyone leaves with exactly what they came for, minus a portion of their patience. The square fills before you've had your first proper look around, stalls jammed together under canvas awnings, vendors shouting over each other in a rolling chorus that somehow includes at least 4 different regional accents, and one very determined Frisian farmer's wife who will not be talked down on the price of her butter. The smell hits you before anything else. Salted fish, fresh bread, sharp cheese, and underneath it all, the exotic, expensive perfume of spices carried halfway around the world specifically to sit in small paper twists on this one stall in front of you. Fishwives command entire corners of the square with a confidence that borders on royalty, gutting and selling herring with a speed that makes your eyes water, tossing scraps to a small, devoted army of cats who have clearly worked out exactly which stall offers the best returns. Cheese sellers stack their wares in towering, precarious pyramids, slicing off samples with a wire tool and a showman's flourish, because a good taste is worth more advertising than any amount of shouting. Haggling isn't rude here. It's expected, almost a social obligation, a small performance where both buyer and seller pretend to be more outraged by the other's position than they actually are, before settling on a price somewhere comfortably in the middle. Walk up, offer half of whatever's quoted, endure a look of theatrical betrayal, and settle somewhere reasonable a minute or two later. Anyone who simply pays the first price named is regarded with the same faint pity reserved for someone who tips a vending machine. Spices command real reverence here. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, sitting in small, precious quantities behind the stall, rather than heaped in open bins. Because these little paper twists represent months of dangerous sea voyage and genuine fortune. A pinch of nutmeg here carries roughly the social weight of a fine piece of jewellery. And you'll notice merchants discussing spice prices with the same intensity your own era reserves for stock tickers. Ever tried to move through a crowded farmer's market on a Saturday morning, elbow to elbow, weaving around strollers and dogs and someone's overly enthusiastic sample table? Now add live poultry, a fishwife defending her patch of cobblestones like territory, and the very real possibility that the man beside you just spent a week's wages on a spice smaller than your thumbnail. You leave eventually, arms full, purse considerably lighter, ears ringing faintly from the shouting, having successfully talked someone down on a wheel of cheese you probably could have afforded at full price anyway. Nobody tells you that. Nobody needs to. The market has already moved on to its next customer, and so, slightly dazed and smelling faintly of herring, do you. It's time to witness something genuinely new to the world, tucked into a courtyard full of shouting men in dark coats. This is the stock exchange, where shares in trading voyages are bought, sold, and gambled on with a fervour usually reserved for horse races. Fortunes are made here in an afternoon, and just as easily lost, all while everyone maintains the studied calm of people who are absolutely panicking on the inside. Step through the archway and the noise hits you first. A wall of overlapping voices, hand signals, and the particular rustle of paper changing hands at speed. Merchants pace designated areas of the courtyard, each corner unofficially assigned to a different trade. Spices here, grain there, shares in a distant voyage somewhere else entirely, so that a man looking to buy into a shipment of cinnamon knows exactly which corner to elbow his way toward. This is, by most accounts, the first true stock exchange the world has seen. A purpose-built home for the very modern idea of owning a small paper slice of something you will never personally touch. What's being traded isn't the goods themselves, but shares. Tiny fractional ownership in whatever a ship brings home, allowing an ordinary merchant to invest in a fraction of a voyage rather than staking everything on cargo of his own. It's a genuinely clever piece of financial engineering, spreading the risk of a dangerous, months-long sea journey across dozens of smaller investors, instead of one man's entire fortune riding on a single hull. It also means the value of those shares swings wildly on nothing more than a rumour, a delayed ship, or a bad storm reported 3 ports away. And the men in this courtyard have learned to read those rumours with the intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse. Watch closely, and you'll see the same small choreography repeated constantly. A man leans in, murmurs a figure. Another shakes his head, walks 3 steps away, is called back, and a deal closes with nothing more than a handshake and a mutually understood nod. There's no shouted final bell here, no glowing ticker, just hundreds of these quiet, urgent little negotiations happening simultaneously. All of them adding up to genuine, staggering sums of money changing hands before lunch. Ever refreshed a stock app on your phone every 4 minutes during a volatile week, telling yourself you're just checking, definitely not panicking? These merchants are doing exactly that, except their information arrives by ship instead of by screen. Weeks late, and a single bad piece of news can wipe out a fortune before anyone even fully understands what happened 3 ports away. By early afternoon, the courtyard begins to empty. Men filing out looking either quietly triumphant or carefully, deliberately unreadable, their expressions giving away nothing about whether they've just made their family's fortune or lost it entirely on a shipment of nutmeg that hasn't been seen in 6 weeks. Tomorrow, without fail, they'll all be back, because uncertainty, it turns out, is a habit every bit as addictive as certainty. Let's talk about how anyone actually learns a trade here, because it isn't a classroom. It's a guild, a tightly run brotherhood of tradesmen who decide who gets to be a baker, a barrel maker, or a silversmith, and who spends the next several years fetching tools and getting yelled at for holding a hammer wrong. Skill is earned slowly, supervised closely, and gate-kept fiercely. A boy entering an apprenticeship at around 12 or 13 doesn't so much learn a craft as get absorbed into it, moving into the workshop, sometimes into the master's own household, trading years of unpaid or barely paid labour for the promise of eventual competence and, if he's very fortunate, guild membership of his own one day. The early years involve mostly the unglamorous groundwork, sweeping, hauling, fetching, watching, doing every task nobody more senior wants to do, while absorbing the actual craft in small, stolen glimpses between chores. The guild itself functions as something between a trade union, a religious brotherhood, and a strict quality control department. It sets the standards for what counts as a properly made barrel or a correctly forged nail, inspects members' work, disciplines anyone caught cutting corners, and firmly controls exactly how many new masters are allowed to set up shop in any given year. This isn't cruelty for its own sake. It's a deliberate system designed to protect the reputation and livelihood of everyone already inside the guild, ensuring the city's goods stay reliably excellent and the market doesn't flood with underqualified competition. Progression follows a genuinely demanding ladder: apprentice first, then journeyman, a title that literally reflects years spent travelling and working under different masters to broaden his skill, and only eventually, if his work earns approval, master, complete with the right to train apprentices of his own. Many, honestly, never quite make it that far, spending entire working lives as skilled journeymen without ever accumulating the capital or reputation needed to open an independent workshop. The discipline is real and occasionally theatrical. A poorly made piece of work might be publicly shamed, displayed, or simply destroyed in front of the offending apprentice as a lesson to everyone watching. A master caught cheating on materials or workmanship faces genuine guild sanctions, fines, or expulsion, which in a trade-dependent city amounts to something close to professional death. Ever spent years in an entry-level job doing unglamorous, thankless tasks, while quietly absorbing the actual skills of the trade from more senior colleagues who occasionally snapped at you for holding something wrong? That's an apprenticeship here, except the hours are longer. The master occasionally has legal authority over your entire life, and there's no LinkedIn to quietly update the moment you finally qualify. By the time a young apprentice finally earns his journeyman papers, he's spent years absorbing not just a craft, but an entire way of belonging. A guild badge, a set of loyalties, a professional identity that will follow him for the rest of his working life. It's slow, it's strict, and it's remarkably effective, which is precisely why the goods leaving this city carry a reputation that ships have sailed thousands of miles specifically to purchase. It's time to get dressed, and the rules are surprisingly strict for a city that prides itself on independence. Black wool, white ruffs, and modest cuts dominate, regardless of how wealthy the person wearing them actually is. Flashy colour is considered slightly suspicious, as though your outfit might be quietly announcing that you've forgotten your Calvinist manners. Pull on the layers expected of you, and you'll notice quickly how much restraint the whole ensemble demands. Black, or something close to it, dominates outerwear for men and women alike. A deep, expensive black that actually required considerable skill and money to dye properly, meaning the sombre colour you'd assume signals modesty is quietly, cleverly signalling wealth instead. A crisp white collar or ruff sits at the throat, starched to an almost architectural stiffness, framing the face like a plate presenting dinner. Underneath the sober exterior, though, the fabric quality tells the real story. A wealthy merchant's black coat is cut from the finest wool money can buy, lined with silk nobody else will ever see, fastened with buttons that cost more than a labourer's monthly wage. It's restraint with an asterisk, modesty performed loudly enough that everyone who matters understands exactly how expensive that modesty was to achieve. Women's clothing follows a similarly composed silhouette: structured bodices, full skirts, a white cap or bonnet covering the hair, and an apron that manages to look both practical and immaculately pressed at once. Jewellery, where it appears at all, tends toward the understated. A modest string of pearls, a small brooch, nothing that would draw an accusing glance from the church across the street. The overall effect for both men and women is a wardrobe that whispers rather than shouts, though the whisper is unmistakably expensive. The reasoning behind all this restraint traces directly back to the city's dominant strain of Protestant belief, which regards excessive display as vanity bordering on sin. Wealth itself isn't condemned. In fact, it's practically celebrated as a sign of God's favour and diligent hard work. But flaunting that wealth through gaudy colour or ostentatious cut crosses an invisible, closely watched line. So the wealthy have developed an entire visual language for displaying fortune without technically displaying it at all, hidden in fabric quality, in the perfect stiffness of a collar, in buttons only a jeweller would recognise as solid silver. Ever gotten dressed for a work event where the unspoken dress code was quiet luxury, plain colours, no logos, but everyone in the room could somehow instantly tell exactly how much everything cost? That's this entire city's wardrobe, several centuries early, minus the influencers explaining it to you afterward. You adjust your own collar, uncomfortably starched and slightly too tight, and step out into the street, looking, you hope, appropriately modest and quietly prosperous all at once. Nobody compliments your outfit directly. That would be far too showy. But you'll notice the subtle, appraising glances all the same, cataloguing exactly how well you've managed to look poor while dressed extremely expensively. Let's talk about the astonishing number of paintings in this city, because practically every household, however modest, has at least one hanging on the wall. Portraits, still lifes, tavern scenes, and moody interiors are being churned out by an enormous population of working artists, one of whom you might occasionally see loitering near the docks, looking for someone to paint. Step into nearly any home on this street, wealthy or otherwise, and you'll find canvases hanging in rooms that a visitor from elsewhere might expect to see completely bare. A humble baker's front room might hold a modest landscape or a simple still life of fish and lemons. The merchant's parlour down the street displays a proper family portrait alongside a moody scene of ships at sea. Art here isn't reserved for palaces and churches the way it is in much of the rest of Europe. It's a genuinely middle-class commodity, produced in staggering quantities and sold in open markets alongside cheese and fish. This flood of paintings exists largely because of who's buying, not who's ruling. With no powerful royal court commissioning grand religious works the way other nations do, painters here have turned instead to an enormous, prosperous merchant class, eager to decorate their narrow, tall houses with something to prove their taste and their means. The result is an entire specialized economy of painting. Artists who focus exclusively on seascapes, others who paint nothing but elaborate arrangements of fruit and dead game, others still who specialize purely in tavern scenes full of drunk peasants behaving badly, each carving out a specific commercial niche the way a modern business might specialize in a particular product line. Walk past a workshop with the shutters open, and you might catch a glimpse of an artist at his easel, working in a room lit carefully from one north-facing window to keep the light consistent throughout the day. He mixes his own pigments from ground minerals and oil, a slow, exacting process that smells faintly of linseed and turpentine, layering thin glazes of paint, one atop another, until a bowl of fruit or a woman reading a letter seems to glow gently from within the canvas itself. Prices vary wildly depending on the artist's reputation, from cheap, mass-produced little landscapes sold at the weekly market for the price of a decent meal, all the way up to significant sums for a recognized master's careful portrait. It's an entire economy built on decoration, aspiration, and the quiet, competitive urge of a merchant class, eager to fill those tall, narrow houses with something to admire. Ever walked into a friend's apartment and immediately clocked the art on their walls as a shorthand for their taste, their travels, their entire personality? That's precisely what's happening on every street of this city, except instead of a framed print from a museum gift shop, it's an original oil painting purchased directly from the artist who ground the pigments himself. You pause at the workshop window a moment longer, watching brushstrokes slowly become a bowl of oysters and a half-peeled lemon, before continuing on your way, quietly wondering whether your own bare lodging walls are about to become a problem you didn't know you had. It's time to discuss religion, which shapes the rhythm of daily life without ever announcing itself too loudly. The official church is strict and Protestant, but the city has a peculiar talent for looking the other way, tolerating hidden Catholic chapels tucked into attics and back rooms, provided nobody makes too much noise about it. Sunday mornings bring the whole street to something close to a standstill. Shops shuttered, work paused, families dressed in their finest, sober black, making their way to services at the grand, austere, reformed churches that dominate the skyline. Inside, the space is strikingly plain by the standards of most of Europe. Whitewashed walls, clear glass, no elaborate statues or gilded altarpieces. Because this particular strain of Protestant belief regards visual splendor in worship as a distraction at best and a sin at worst. The sermon, delivered at considerable length, forms the actual centerpiece of the service, and you'll notice the congregation settling in with the resigned patience of people who have budgeted a genuinely significant portion of their morning for listening. But wander a few streets over into what looks like an entirely ordinary merchant's house, and you might find something the official church would very much prefer didn't exist. A full, hidden chapel tucked into the upper floors or the attic, discreet from the street, elaborate and warm inside, serving the city's considerable Catholic population, who are technically forbidden from worshipping publicly. The city's authorities know perfectly well these hidden churches exist. Everyone knows. The arrangement survives on a distinctly practical understanding that as long as nothing is flaunted, as long as the front door looks like any other front door, official eyes will remain politely, profitably closed. This quiet tolerance extends further still to communities of Jewish merchants and refugees who have found a genuinely rare welcome here compared to much of the rest of Europe, building synagogues, running businesses, and contributing enormously to the city's trade and prosperity. It isn't universal equality by any modern measure. Restrictions and prejudices absolutely persist. But compared to the outright expulsions and persecutions happening elsewhere on the continent, this city has built its reputation partly on a pragmatic, commercially minded willingness to let people worship differently, as long as the ledgers keep balancing. Ever worked somewhere with an official dress code that everyone quietly, collectively agreed to ignore about half of the time, because enforcing it too strictly would make everyone's lives harder for no real benefit? That's religious tolerance here in miniature. A rulebook that exists mostly on paper, softened considerably in daily practice by a city that has learned trade flourishes best when nobody's checking too closely what happens behind everyone else's closed doors. You attend the long Sunday service as expected. Sit through the sermon with the same patient resignation as your neighbours, and later, walking home, glance up at an unremarkable attic window where you now know, with a small, conspiratorial thrill, an entirely different congregation is worshipping in comfortable, tolerated secrecy. Let's talk about the strange new drinks arriving on every incoming ship, because coffee and tea have just landed in polite society, and nobody's entirely sure what to make of them yet. Physicians debate whether they're a tonic or a poison. Wealthy households treat them as a status symbol, and you'll be expected to sip something bitter and pretend you understand the fuss. You're handed a small, delicate cup of something dark, hot, and startlingly bitter, and every eye in the drawing room watches your reaction with genuine interest, because this particular bean, hauled across oceans at extraordinary expense, is still enough of a novelty that serving it properly counts as a genuine social event. The hostess describes, with evident pride, the exact distant port this particular batch travelled from, and you nod along, sipping carefully, trying not to visibly wince at a flavour your palate has absolutely no context for. Tea arrives with its own small ceremony, brewed weak by later standards, and served in tiny porcelain cups imported all the way from China, themselves treated as precious objects worth displaying on a special shelf when not in use. The wealthy compete quietly over who serves the finest, freshest leaves, who owns the most elegant teapot, who can discuss the subtle differences between varieties with the most convincing authority. Most of it, if you listen closely, invented on the spot. Physicians of the era hold forth on both drinks with tremendous confidence and absolutely no agreement whatsoever. One learned gentleman insists coffee sharpens the mind and aids digestion beautifully. Another, equally learned, warns darkly that it dries the blood and induces a dangerous nervous excitement in delicate constitutions. Tea receives the same contradictory treatment. Praised as a gentle tonic for the nerves by one camp, and condemned as a foreign, faintly suspicious habit, likely to weaken the national character by another. Nobody has any actual evidence either way. Everyone has an opinion, regardless. What nobody disputes is the price, because both coffee and tea remain luxuries reserved almost exclusively for households with real money to spare. Small quantities doled out carefully from a locked cabinet, the way you might guard something considerably more valuable than dried leaves and beans. Serving either one to guests signals unmistakably that you can afford to. Ever watched an entire industry spring up around a beverage nobody's fully sure is good for you, complete with contradictory health claims, elaborate rituals, and people who will happily discuss its subtle flavour notes with an authority that seems suspiciously improvised? That's coffee and tea in this drawing room right now. Several centuries before anyone invents the phrase, notes of caramel and stone fruit, with a completely straight face. You finish your small, bitter cup, decline the offer of a second out of genuine uncertainty about your own nervous excitement, and admire, at least, the tiny painted porcelain it arrived in. Whatever this drink eventually becomes to the rest of the world, right now, in this room, it's simply the most fashionable form of showing off available that doesn't require an actual ship of your own. It's time to talk about the children of the house, who are marched off each morning to be drilled in reading, writing, and arithmetic with a seriousness that would surprise you. Literacy rates here are shockingly high for the era, driven by a culture that expects even a merchant's daughter to keep the books when her husband is away at sea. Watch the street in the early morning, and you'll see a genuinely unusual sight for this century. Both boys and girls, satchels or slates tucked under their arms, walking briskly toward one of the city's many small schools, rather than heading straight into a workshop or a kitchen. Education here isn't reserved solely for the sons of the wealthy, the way it is in much of the rest of Europe. A remarkably broad swath of the population, boys and girls, rich and reasonably modest alike, learn to read, write, and calculate. Because a trading city, it turns out, has very little patience for illiteracy when contracts, ledgers, and correspondence keep the whole enterprise running. Inside, the schoolroom is cramped, loud, and thoroughly unglamorous. Rows of children reciting their letters aloud in overlapping unison, while a strict schoolmaster paces between the benches with a switch he is entirely prepared to use on anyone caught daydreaming. Slates squeak, chalk dust hangs in the air, and the youngest children work laboriously through their letters, while the oldest tackle proper sums and formal penmanship, the elegant, looping handwriting expected of any respectable clerk or merchant's correspondence. Girls receive a genuinely notable share of this instruction, not out of any particularly progressive ideal, but out of hard, practical necessity. A merchant's wife is routinely expected to manage the household accounts, correspond with suppliers, and occasionally run the entire business outright for months at a time, while her husband is at sea or travelling inland. And none of that is possible without solid reading, writing, and arithmetic of her own. Literacy here isn't a nicety. It's basic professional infrastructure, no different from teaching a modern child to use a computer. Discipline is genuinely strict by any modern measure, with corporal punishment an entirely normal and expected part of the schoolroom, and a child who arrives late or fumbles a recitation can expect a sharp rap across the knuckles without much ceremony. Nobody in the room considers this remarkable. It's simply how learning happens, the same way your own childhood might have considered detention or a stern note home as an unremarkable consequence of getting caught passing notes. Ever sat in a classroom watching the clock, silently begging for the lesson to end, while a teacher who has clearly had enough of everyone's nonsense paces the aisles? Swap the clock for an hourglass, and the teacher's patience for something considerably shorter, and you've got the picture precisely. The children spill back out onto the street at midday, slates tucked back under their arms, already comparing whose knuckles took the worst of the morning's lesson, before heading home to a lunch that will be followed, almost certainly, by another few hours of exactly the same thing that afternoon. It's rigorous, it's occasionally brutal, and it has produced, somewhat remarkably, one of the most literate populations anywhere on the continent. Let's discuss romance, which here is a far more practical and businesslike affair than the candlelit fantasy you might be picturing. Courting couples are chaperoned, correspondence is often blunt, and a proposal has as much to do with a dowry and a solid trade connection as it does with anyone's fluttering heart. A young man interested in a particular young woman doesn't simply appear at her window with a bouquet and a poem. He calls at the house, formally, under the watchful eye of her parents, and conversation tends to circle practical matters almost as much as personal affection, his prospects in trade, his family's reputation, whether he's likely to make a reliable, steady living rather than a dashing, unreliable one. Love, where it exists, is expected to grow alongside these more practical considerations rather than instead of them, and nobody finds that arrangement particularly unromantic. It's simply how a sensible match gets made. Letters between courting couples, where they survive, reveal a tone that might surprise you, warm certainly, but often remarkably direct and unsentimental by later romantic standards, discussing household finances, family obligations, and shared expectations with the same straightforward clarity you might expect from a business letter. Flowery declarations of undying passion exist, certainly, but they sit comfortably alongside entirely unglamorous discussions of who will manage the household accounts once married. The dowry itself carries real weight in these negotiations, a sum or property the bride's family provides to help establish the new household, and negotiating its size is treated with the same careful seriousness as any trade agreement, sometimes literally conducted by the same fathers who negotiate actual trade agreements during the working week. A poorly matched dowry can sink a promising courtship just as thoroughly as any personal incompatibility, which tells you something about how tightly romance and commerce are woven together in this particular corner of the world. Once a match is settled, the betrothal itself is a genuinely serious legal step, formally registered, sometimes celebrated with its own small ceremony, treated as considerably more binding than a casual modern engagement. Breaking one off isn't scandalous exactly, but it does require real justification and tends to generate exactly the kind of gossip that ripples up and down a street where, as you've already learned, everyone's business is quietly everyone else's business too. Ever gone on a promising first date, only to find the conversation drifting, unprompted, towards salaries, career plans, and whether either of you actually wants children, and left wondering if that's romantic or simply sensible? Courtship here runs on precisely that energy, formalised, chaperoned, and entirely unembarrassed about discussing money in the same breath as affection. Eventually, if the accounts balance and the affection holds, a wedding follows, modest by the standards of grander nations, practical, well documented, and quietly, genuinely warm underneath all the business-like negotiation. It isn't the sweeping romance of a storybook, but watch a long-married couple in this city, the private ease between them, the shorthand jokes at the dinner table, and you'll notice something that looks remarkably like real, durable affection, built the slow, sensible way. It's time to meet one of the more surprising figures in this household, the wife who is quietly running half the family business while her husband is off negotiating shipments abroad. Dutch law grants married women a startling amount of legal and financial independence for the era, and she uses every bit of it. Watch her for a single afternoon and you'll see her move fluidly between roles that most of Europe would insist belong to entirely separate people. She reviews the household accounts with the same brisk attention she gives a supplier's letter, corrects an error in a shipment invoice without needing anyone's permission, and dispatches a reply to a business associate in her own hand, in her own words, with an authority that would raise eyebrows almost anywhere else on the continent. This isn't unusual for her. It's simply Tuesday. Dutch law here permits married women to trade independently, sign contracts, and manage significant business affairs in ways that many other European legal systems flatly deny wives at the time. A merchant's wife left in charge while her husband travels isn't merely minding the store until he returns. She's making genuine decisions, negotiating with suppliers, managing debts and credit, sometimes expanding the business considerably before he's even back on dry land. Visitors from other parts of Europe frequently remark, with a mixture of admiration and faint scandal, on just how much authority these wives seem to wield compared to what they're used to at home. This independence comes wrapped, naturally, in the same rigid expectations of domestic modesty and religious propriety that govern every other part of her life. Nobody would describe this arrangement as feminism in any modern sense, and plenty of legal and social restrictions still very much apply. But within the specific, practical sphere of household finance and family business, the merchant's wife operates with a genuine authority that would surprise anyone stepping in from London or Paris, expecting to find a quiet, decorative figure confined strictly to the kitchen and the nursery. Her days blend seamlessly between domestic management and genuine commercial responsibility, overseeing the maid's work, managing the children's education, and reviewing a ledger entry over dinner with the same unhurried competence, switching between roles the way you might switch between browser tabs, without ever quite considering it remarkable. Ever worked with someone who seems to run an entire department quietly, efficiently, and almost invisibly, while someone with a grander title gets all the public credit for decisions she actually made? That's the merchant's wife here, minus even the grumbling, because she genuinely doesn't seem to mind the arrangement, having negotiated a real and substantial sphere of authority within a system that offers her considerably more room to maneuver than most of her European counterparts could ever hope for. By evening, her husband returns from the docks, tired and full of news about the day's shipments, and she updates him briskly on the accounts, the correspondence, the small crisis with a supplier that she's already quietly resolved without needing to trouble him at all. He nods, grateful, mildly impressed, and entirely unsurprised. This is simply how the household runs, and has, quite successfully, for years. Let's talk about winter, because when the canals freeze solid, the entire city transforms into something between a skating rink and a street party. Merchants, maids, and children alike lace up wooden skates and glide over water that was a shipping lane just weeks before, selling waffles and hot spiced wine along the ice. Step outside on a properly cold morning and the transformation is startling. The same canal that carried barges of cheese and cargo just weeks earlier now stands frozen thick enough to bear the weight of the entire neighborhood at once. The ice rings and creaks underfoot, cold enough that your breath hangs in visible clouds, and the whole street seems to have collectively decided that today business can wait a little, because the canal has become something far more interesting than a shipping route. Skaters glide past in every direction, wooden blades strapped to their boots, moving with a fluid, practiced grace that suggests this isn't a novelty for anyone involved, but a genuinely ordinary part of the winter calendar. Children race each other between the bridges. A dignified older gentleman skates past with his hands clasped behind his back, moving at a stately pace that manages to look both effortless and faintly smug. Somewhere nearby, someone has set up a small stall directly on the ice itself, selling waffles hot off an iron griddle, the smell of caramelized sugar cutting cleanly through the cold air, alongside mugs of spiced wine that warm your hands before you've even taken a sip. The frozen canal briefly erases some of the city's usual social boundaries too. Merchants and maids, wealthy families and dock workers, all sharing the same stretch of ice, all subject equally to the indignity of an unexpected tumble in front of an audience. Skating here isn't a luxury pastime reserved for the well-off. It's genuinely, delightfully universal. Cheap enough that nearly anyone can strap on a pair of blades and join in, and popular enough that entire courtships have reportedly been conducted almost entirely on skates, gliding along side by side under the pretense of simply enjoying the weather. The novelty carries real risk alongside the charm, of course. Ice that looks solid near the edges can be treacherously thin further out, and every winter brings its share of cautionary stories about someone who skated somewhere they really shouldn't have. Locals develop an almost instinctive sense for testing the ice's thickness, a skill you have not remotely developed yet, and would be wise to simply trust the person beside you rather than test independently. Ever watched an entire office quietly abandon its usual seriousness the moment the first proper snow falls? Everyone suddenly grinning, gathering at the window, briefly, gloriously unified by the sheer novelty of the weather. That's this entire city. Except instead of snow through a window, it's an entire shipping lane turned into a playground. And instead of watching from inside, everyone's already lacing up their skates. By the time dusk falls, lanterns appear along the canal's edge, and the skating continues well into the darkness, laughter and the scrape of blades echoing off the tall, narrow houses on either side. For one brief, cold, glittering season, the canal stops being a road, a sewer, and a delivery route all at once, and becomes, simply and completely, a place of pure delight. It's time to discuss the city's greatest fear. Because a place built almost entirely of timber, tar, and tightly packed houses treats fire the way other cities treat the plague. A night watchman patrols the streets, calling the hour, listening for the crackle that means disaster, ready to raise an alarm that will have the entire street hauling buckets within minutes. Lie awake in your box bed and you'll hear him eventually. Footsteps echoing off the cobblestones, a lantern swinging faint light across the shuttered windows, and a voice calling out the hour in a long, practiced tone that carries clearly down the narrow street. This is the night watch, a small but genuinely essential part of the city's defences, patrolling through the darkest hours, specifically listening, watching, and sniffing the air for the first hint of smoke in a city that has learned, through painful, repeated experience, exactly how quickly a single spark can become a genuine catastrophe. The danger here is entirely real and constantly present. These houses are built largely of timber framing, sealed with tar for waterproofing, packed together so tightly along the canals that a fire starting in one household's kitchen can leap to the next roof within minutes. Open flames light every room after dark. Candles, oil lamps, cooking fires, all of it burning constantly in buildings that are, structurally speaking, essentially very tall, very narrow piles of kindling with people living inside. When the watchman does spot trouble, the response is immediate and remarkably well organised for the era. A church bell rings out a specific pattern to signal exactly which part of the city needs help, and residents spill into the street with leather buckets, ready to form a human chain from the nearest canal straight to the flames. Some households keep a fire hook by the door, specifically for pulling burning thatch or timber away from the main structure. And the Guild of Carpenters, given their obvious expertise with timber buildings, often plays a central role in the actual firefighting effort itself. Insurance, in a genuinely early and clever form, has already begun to appear here too. Wealthy households pooling money into mutual funds specifically to cover the catastrophic cost of losing a home to fire. An early ancestor of the policy you might quietly maintain on your own house back home, minus the paperwork and the actuary tables. Ever lived somewhere prone to a particular natural disaster and noticed how the whole community developed an almost instinctive, practiced calm about the warning signs, an alarm everyone recognizes immediately and knows exactly how to respond to without needing instructions? That's fire here, a constant, quietly managed threat that the entire street has collectively rehearsed responding to more times than anyone would like to admit. You drift back towards sleep as the watchman's footsteps fade further down the street, his voice calling the hour one final time before rounding the corner. The canal outside sits calm and dark. The tar-sealed timber above your head creaks gently in the cold. Somewhere out there, a stranger with a lantern is quietly making sure you get to wake up in this narrow, crooked, flammable little house tomorrow morning. Let's talk about getting sick here, which involves a visit to an apothecary's shop lined with jars of herbs, powders, and a few remedies that are more hopeful than effective. Doctors are expensive and often wrong. The apothecary, meanwhile, will sell you something bitter, tell you to rest, and quietly hope for the best right alongside you. Push open the door and the smell greets you first. Dried herbs, sharp mineral powders, and something faintly medicinal underneath it all that you can't quite place and probably shouldn't ask about too closely. Shelves rise floor to ceiling, crowded with labelled jars and small drawers, each one containing some carefully measured remedy for whatever ails you. Willow bark for fever, chamomile for nerves, and a handful of more exotic imported ingredients that cost considerably more and work, by most honest accounts, roughly the same amount as the cheap local herbs sitting right beside them. The apothecary himself occupies a curious, useful place in the city's medical hierarchy, considerably cheaper than a formally trained physician, considerably more available, and in practice consulted far more often for everyday ailments. He'll examine your symptoms, ask a few practical questions, and mix something from his shelves with genuine confidence, even when that confidence occasionally outpaces the actual science backing it up. Bloodletting remains a common recommendation for all manner of complaints, on the theory that illness stems from an imbalance of bodily humours that a bit of careful bleeding can helpfully correct. It doesn't particularly, but it will be recommended with total sincerity regardless. Physicians, when actually consulted, cost considerably more and bring with them an impressive vocabulary of Latin diagnoses that sound reassuringly precise without necessarily translating into treatments that work any better than the apothecary's herbs. A wealthy household might call one in for a serious complaint, listen gravely to his pronouncement, pay a genuinely substantial fee, and then quietly follow the exact same rest, broth, and herbal tea regimen the apothecary would have suggested for a fraction of the cost. Some remedies genuinely do work. Herbal treatments for digestive troubles, willow bark's mild pain relief, honey for a sore throat, developed through generations of careful observation, even without any formal understanding of why they help. Others rest on theories about bodily humours and astrological influence that modern medicine has long since quietly abandoned, though nobody in this shop has any reason yet to doubt them. Ever gone to a doctor with a minor complaint and left with a bill considerably larger than the actual value of the advice, which amounted mostly to rest, drink water, and wait it out? That's a visit to the physician here, except swap the copay for a genuinely startling sum of guilders and swap the modern diagnosis for a solemn pronouncement about your humours being out of balance. You leave the apothecary's shop with a small paper twist of bitter herb tea and firm instructions to rest, keep warm, and return if things worsen, which is, honestly, roughly the same advice you'd receive from any pharmacy back home, delivered with considerably more Latin and considerably less certainty about what's actually wrong with you. It's time to talk about what happens to those the city's prosperity leaves behind, because Amsterdam has built an entire system of orphanages, almshouses, and charitable courtyards to care for widows, orphans, and the elderly poor. It's a genuinely progressive system for its time, funded in part by wealthy merchants easing a guilty Calvinist conscience. Walk through a quiet courtyard, tucked behind an unassuming gate, and you might stumble on one of these institutions almost by accident. A peaceful, orderly cluster of small dwellings arranged around a central garden, housing elderly residents, widows, or orphan children in conditions considerably more comfortable and dignified than the grim workhouses found in much of the rest of Europe. Regents, drawn from the city's wealthy merchant class, oversee these institutions as a genuine civic and religious duty, managing the funds and provisions with the same careful diligence they'd bring to their own trading ledgers. The city's orphanage, a particularly notable example, houses hundreds of children at once, dressed in a distinctive uniform, half one colour and half another, specifically so that any child spotted wandering the streets alone is instantly recognisable and can be returned promptly. A surprisingly practical bit of civic design layered over a genuinely compassionate purpose. The children receive education, a trade apprenticeship eventually, and a structured, if strict, upbringing considerably better resourced than similar institutions elsewhere on the continent. Funding for all of this flows from a distinctly Dutch combination of civic pride, religious obligation, and, honestly, genuine social pressure. A wealthy merchant who has made a considerable fortune through trade, some of it distinctly rougher and more exploitative than polite conversation cares to acknowledge, finds in charitable giving a convenient, visible way of demonstrating piety and easing whatever discomfort his conscience might quietly be nursing. Portraits of these civic-minded regents hang proudly in the very institutions they oversee, a public, permanent record of generosity that also happens to be excellent for one's reputation. The system isn't without real limits and real unfairness. Charity here tends to favour the city's own established poor, widows, and orphans of respectable reformed families, considerably more readily than it extends to newer immigrants, the wandering poor, or those considered less deserving by the standards of the day. Its compassion with careful, quietly enforced boundaries, generous within limits the city has drawn for itself. Ever donated to a cause specifically because it looked good on your annual review, or because everyone at the office was quietly watching who gave and how much. That's civic charity here in miniature. Genuine compassion, tangled up thoroughly with reputation management, both motives operating simultaneously without anyone finding that combination particularly hypocritical. You linger a moment at the courtyard gate, watching a group of uniformed orphan children cross the garden in orderly pairs, before continuing on your way, quietly grateful that whatever fortune brought you to this city, you're not currently relying on the regent's careful ledger of who deserves a warm bed tonight. Let's head down to the harbour, where ships arrive groaning under the weight of spices, silks, porcelain, and timber from ports most people in this city will never see themselves. It is a genuine spectacle of global trade, and also, we should say plainly, a system built in significant part on colonial exploitation and forced labour, whose profits lined the very houses you've been touring tonight. Stand at the harbour's edge, and the scale of it is genuinely difficult to take in. Forests of masts stretching along the waterfront, ships arriving and departing in a constant, restless rhythm, their holds packed with goods gathered from trading posts scattered across Asia, the Americas, and Africa. Sailors haul crates of pepper and cinnamon down the gangplank, their skin weathered from months at sea, their conversation a rough patchwork of languages picked up in a dozen distant ports. The smell rolling off the docks shifts by the crate, salt and tar giving way suddenly to cinnamon, then pepper, then the sharp bite of unfamiliar timber unloaded fresh from the hold. This entire operation is organised on a scale genuinely unprecedented for its time, through powerful trading companies granted extraordinary authority by the state itself. The power to wage war, negotiate treaties, and govern territory on the other side of the world entirely independent of the government back home. It is, in effect, a private commercial empire, and the wealth flowing back through this harbour into the tall, narrow houses lining every canal in the city comes directly from that empire's reach. It would be dishonest, and frankly disrespectful to history, to describe this trade without naming plainly what financed a considerable share of it. Enormous profits flowed from a brutal, exploitative system of forced labour and colonial control, from the transatlantic slave trade and the plantations it fed, from territories seized and administered with a violence that the elegant paintings hanging in these merchants' parlours never once depict. The gleaming cheese and cinnamon on your breakfast table, the fine imported porcelain displayed proudly in the front room, the very stones of prosperity this city stands on, rest in real part on suffering inflicted thousands of miles from this harbour. Suffering the wealthy families living here rarely had cause to see or acknowledge directly. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and an honest account has to hold them together rather than choosing the comfortable half.
This harbour represents a genuine, remarkable achievement of maritime skill, financial innovation, and global connection unlike anything the world had seen before. It is also inseparable from immense and deliberate human cost, borne by people who never once set foot on this quay and never saw a guilder of the fortune their labour made possible.
Ever admired a beautifully renovated old building, only to learn afterward, uncomfortably, exactly what its original money came from? That's this entire harbour, glittering, bustling and magnificent, resting on a foundation considerably less magnificent than the view suggests. You watch one more ship ease into its berth, sailors already swarming to unload it, and turn back toward the city's narrow streets carrying that same uneasy, necessary weight the whole harbour seems to hold quietly beneath its surface. Prosperity here was never free. Someone, somewhere, always paid for it. And it usually wasn't the person living in the tall house by the canal. It's time for the day to wind down, which means a modest supper, perhaps a stop at a smoky tavern for a mug of beer and the day's gossip, before climbing that impossible staircase one final time and folding yourself back into your cupboard bed. The candle gutters out, the canal outside goes quiet, and the whole narrow, crooked, brilliant house finally settles in for the night. Supper itself is unhurried compared to the brisk efficiency of breakfast. A simple stew, perhaps, thick with barley and whatever vegetables the market offered that morning, eaten around the same crowded table where the whole household gathered at dawn. Conversation runs looser here, the merchant recounting some small triumph or frustration from the exchange, his wife updating him on a supplier's letter, the children finally permitted to talk without quite as much correction as usual. It's the one meal of the day that feels, briefly, like more than fuel. If you've got any energy left, and honestly, most nights you won't, a stop at the local tavern rounds out the evening properly. Smoke hangs thick in the low-ceilinged room, part tobacco and part the fire struggling to keep up with the chill, while sailors, dock workers, and the odd off-duty clerk crowd onto benches trading news from the harbour, complaints about a guildmaster, and gossip about whichever neighbour's business is currently the street's favourite topic. The beer here is considerably stronger than the mild breakfast variety, and the volume of the room rises accordingly as the evening wears on. Eventually, though, the candle burns low, and there's nothing left to do but make the long, familiar climb back up that impossibly steep staircase, gripping the rope rail with the same practiced caution you started the day with, though noticeably less panic now than your first attempt. The house creaks and settles around you, timber contracting in the evening cool, the tar-sealed roof ticking faintly overhead. Outside, the canal that carried barges and rumours and questionable runoff all day long finally goes still, its surface catching whatever thin moonlight makes it between the tall, gabled rooftops. You fold yourself into the box bed, propped nearly upright the way the whole household insists is proper, pulling the little wooden doors most of the way shut against the draught. Somewhere below, the maid is still moving quietly through her final tasks, banking the fire, checking the door latch, making sure the night watch will find nothing amiss on this particular stretch of street tonight. Ever finished a long day so thoroughly that even an objectively strange sleeping arrangement, upright, boxed in, faintly cramped, feels like the most natural comfort in the world. That's tonight, in this house, after a day of hoisted furniture, scrubbed stoops, market haggling, and quietly complicated fortunes made and lost by canal light. The candle finally gutters out. The stairs, the canal, the gable hook, the whole narrow, brilliant house go quiet around you, holding its centuries of ledgers and gossip and hidden chapels and hard-won prosperity close, the way it always has, waiting patiently for the household bell to ring again come morning. Let's bring this long night in Amsterdam gently to a close. You arrived by barge, weighed down by a trunk that had to be hoisted through a window because the house itself refused to let it in the ordinary way. You climbed a staircase built for people who had already made peace with gravity, folded yourself into a wooden cupboard to sleep sitting upright, and learned to love a canal that was, depending on the hour, a road, a drain, a delivery service, and occasionally all three at once. You haggled at the market, watched fortunes rise and vanish in a shouting courtyard, and sipped something bitter out of politeness while an entire room watched to see if you'd wince. But underneath all of it, the scrubbed stoops and the strict schoolrooms, the hidden chapels and the merchant's wife quietly running half the business, there was something sturdier than the joke. A city built on soggy, reclaimed ground, narrow by necessity and stubborn by nature, found a way to make room for trade, for tolerance, for art on every wall and literacy in every household, even as its prosperity rested, uncomfortably and undeniably, on suffering carried out of sight, thousands of miles from the canal outside your window. Both things happened here. Both things are still worth remembering honestly, together, rather than separately. So tonight, as you sink into your own flat, wide, generously horizontal bed, with no rope hook overhead and no staircase plotting against your knees, maybe spare a quiet thought for the people who built a life in those tall, tilted houses. The ones who scrubbed the same stoop every single morning, who skated across a frozen shipping lane just for the joy of it, who kept careful ledgers by candlelight while the night watch called the hour outside. Because travel, even travel of the imagination, has a way of reminding you that comfort is not the default setting of human history. It's something people build, brick by narrow brick, stair by treacherous stair, usually without much choice in the matter. Rest easy tonight. No hooks, no ropes, no cupboard beds required. Just you, your own quiet room, and a house that for once doesn't need you to climb anything at all. Sleep well.